Good afternoon, or late afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's your Kiwi Connection here, Kevmo7, and we've been having some wild weather here in New Zealand, so this video is coming to you a bit later, sort of late afternoon now, because I had a power cut during my filming just before, and that sort of put things on hold. Anyhow, we're going to carry on regardless, and we're bringing another 280X Showdown. This time it's going to be Sapphire's top 280X, the Toxic, going up with their base model, the Dual X 280X. So this will be quite interesting. I want to sort of highlight the differences. That's why I'm not comparing the Dual X to the Vapor-X, although I'll throw a few comparisons in there just for good measure. Because I want to see how big of a difference there is from the base model 280X that Sapphire brings to the market and the top model 280X, which is the Toxic. So we'll start off with the differences between these two cars. So the Toxic obviously has higher clock speed. They're obviously the same GPU, the Tahiti, a 28nm GPU. But the Toxic comes in at 1150 MHz, that's on boost, and 1100 MHz normally on the GPU, whereas the Dual X comes in at 870 MHz off boost and 1020 MHz on boost. So there's quite a massive difference there. You know, about 130 MHz more on boost on the Toxic. So a big difference there, and there's also a difference in the effective memory clock speed. So the Toxic is sitting at 6,400 MHz effective memory clock as opposed to the 6,000 MHz of the Dual X. Now where does the Vapor-X come in all this? The Vapor-X has a 1070 MHz GPU speed and 6,200 MHz effective memory speed. So the Vapor-X sits right in the middle. Now there's also a difference in size, obviously, because the Toxic card is the 3-fan, you know, the Tri-X design that's pretty much the same as the one on the R9 290. Whereas the Dual X is more similar to the Vapor-X. They're very similar cards. Obviously Vapor-X has the different heat sinks, the vapor chamber heat sinks on them. They also have a different fan design and a backplate. But they're pretty similar cards. However, the Toxic comes in at 308 millimeters long, opposed to the Dual X's 262 millimeters long, quite a bit shorter. They're both pretty much the same width, with the Toxic being 113 millimeters to the 112 of the Dual X, so pretty much the same width. But the Toxic is 41 millimeters tall or high, compared to the 34 millimeters tall of the Dual X. So the Toxic is quite a bit of a larger card, width-wise, although they're pretty much the same. Now let's get straight into the benchmarks before I have another power cut. Up first is firmware. So this is 1080p, 4x MSAA, and I run it for 15 minutes, and I take the average frames per second. So the Dual X 280X from Sapphire scored 24 frames per second average. The Toxic 280X, also from Sapphire, scored to 24 frames per second average. So exactly the same with firmware, which is quite curious. So I'm not sure why that was really. But anyways, onwards. So Unigine Valley. This is on the Extreme HD preset. The Dual X 44.3 frames per second average. The Toxic 48 frames per second average. So that's decent difference there, about almost 4 frames better on that Toxic over the Dual X. So we're really seeing that higher GPU and memory clock speed coming in there. Now Unigine Heaven 4.0. This is DirectX 11 1080p, everything maxed out. The Dual X 280X scored 36.6 frames per second average. The Toxic scored 39.1 frames per second average. So that one was a little bit closer. So about 2.5 frames per second better on the Toxic. So that's a bit closer. Sticking with Heaven again, this is OpenGL 1080p, everything maxed out. The Dual X 280X 29.8 frames per second. The Toxic 280X 32.1 frames per second average, so about 2 frames there as well. Now into some games. So Tomb Raider, this is 1080p, everything maxed out without VSync. The DualX 280X, 63.3 frames per second. The Toxic 280X, 70 frames per second flat. So that's, almost 7 frames there in Tomb Raider, although the DualX still managed to average above 60 frames. So that's still good. And lastly, Bioshock Infinite. The DualX 280X, 93.5 frames per second average. This is Bioshock, everything maxed out. The Toxic 280X, 99.4 frames per second average. So that was quite big as well. To be expected, really, these benchmarks. Obviously, with higher clock speeds, is obviously going to get better frames. But considering for the most part it was, 2, 3, 4 frames per second. I know some of the higher ones are about 7 frames per second better. So there is a bit of a difference there. So you have to take that into consideration when purchasing these cards. The Toxic is going to get, let's say, an average of 4 to 5 frames per second better than the DualX. Now to cooling. So this is the interesting one. So obviously the DualX has a more similar cooling design to the Vapor-X, but with standard heat sinks on it instead of the vapor chamber heat sinks. Where the Toxic has a 3-fan design and is quite a bit larger, bigger heat sinks on it. So in Furmark, the highest temperature I saw on the DualX was 73 degrees Celsius. Now, remember that these aren't 290s and 290Xs, so they won't run up to 95. They're good for 85 as their thermal limit, but most people say keeping it under 80 is pretty good. After you go after 80, they can get a bit grumpy. So 73 is great. The Toxic 280X, so in Furmark again, the highest temperature I saw was 73 degrees Celsius, so they scored exactly the same. The fan difference was very similar as well. 61% fan speed max on the DualX and 64% fan speed max on the Toxic. Now, someone commented that obviously these fans are different in size and obviously the amount, but I just threw that in there still because it's good to know if you're going to run an aggressive fan curve how much leeway you have to bump up those fan speeds, which will of course increase the cooling. And if a card's like some of those gigabyte ones are already running at say 90% fan speed, there's not much headroom there to run an even more aggressive fan curve in order to cool it even more. So that one was quite interesting. This does not mean that the cooler on the DualX is better than the Toxic, because that is massively different speeds on these cards. So to score exactly the same shows that the Toxic is a great cooler, that it can hold it to the same temperature as the DualX, even with the higher voltages and higher speeds. I also took the highest temperature in my Heaven 4.0 benchmark, and the highest on the DualX I saw was 68 degrees Celsius, and the highest I saw in the Toxic was 68 degrees Celsius. So these cards basically go blow for blow in terms of cooling. As I said, if you brought the DualX up to the same speed as the Toxic, then you'd probably find that it would perform much worse in terms of cooling. So it's pretty good to see that the Toxic, even with the increased voltages and speeds, can cool as effectively as the DualX, even with its lower speeds. Just for reference, the Vapor-X scored 68 degrees in Furmark at 41% fan speed. So the Vapor-X, again, is running slightly lower speeds than the Toxic, actually performed really, really well. And in the Heaven benchmark, it scored 63. So that's pretty good. I mean, it's about, 5 degrees less in both tests than the Toxic and the DualX. So the comparison between the DualX and the Vapor-X is obvious to see. It's about 5 degrees Celsius better on the Vapor-X, even though it's clocked slightly higher on both GPU and memory. And it actually scores better than the Toxic. So, but if you bumped up those speeds to the same as the Toxic on the Vapor-X, I think you'd see that they'd be quite similar. So there is that too. Now to noise. So I've said this before, the Toxic I got had the shroud vibration issue that a few of them have. People have the same problem on the Tri-X's and the 290s and 290X's as well. It's just something funny. Some of them are like it. I'm pretty sure you can RMA them if they do that. So, and yours probably won't be like that if you got one of these, but it can happen, and the one I got happened to do it. So, it's harder to do this because of that noise, but from personal experience, these are very similar in terms of noise. But I'll let you decide. So here is the Dual X 280X at idle. And here is the Toxic 280X at idle. So both pretty much silent. There's not much difference between them. Now here is the Dual X on load. This is during the Unigine Valley benchmark. And here is the Toxic on load, but remember it has the vibration issue, so try ignore that and just listen for the fan speed. So pretty similar there. There's not much to say really in noise. Obviously these cool about the same and the fan speeds are about the same. So there's not really that much difference. I'd say if the Toxic didn't have its vibration shroud issue, making all that noise, then I'd probably say it is slightly quieter, but not by much. Just because it's got 3 sort of lower speed fans on it. Now, overall, what can I say? It's, you know, these Sapphire cars, because there's 3 you can pick with the 280Xs, so, and they obviously go up with the Dual X being the sort of like base model, Vapor-X being the middle model, and the Toxic being the highest model. What do you get for the difference? Well, you know, the frames go up, but the difference between, say, the Dual X to the Vapor-X is, say, 2 frames, and then from the Vapor-X to the Toxic is about 2 frames. So that's why I said about 4 to 5 frames different from the base model to the top model. And then the Vapor-X comes in right in between, about, say, 2.5 frames average better than the Dual X, and the Toxic is about 2.5 frames better than the Vapor-X. So it goes up. Honestly, I'd say it's where your budget lies, and the cooling on the SCART, as I said, is very good, with the Vapor-X being the best. So if you're into overclocking, then I'd definitely say go for the Vapor-X over the Dual X, because you'll have a lot more headroom then for overclocking. But in what I rate these cards overall, it pretty much goes as they've structured it, with the Dual X being sort of the third, and then the Vapor-X being second, and the Toxic being the best. As I said though, is it worth getting the Toxic over the Vapor-X? That's hard to say. A lot of people find that Vapor-Xs can be quite loud. A lot of people have said that, especially the old 7970 Vapor-Xs. So there's that to take into consideration. But yeah, if you're not looking to overclock, then just take it as that. Each one you go up, you're getting about 2.5 frames per second. So if you got the money, go for that Toxic. But if you don't have as much, you get the Dual X, and you'll only be seeing about 5 frames per second less than the Toxic. As I said, if I was to pick one for overclocking, the Toxic already has the highest factory clock speed, but if you're going to clock it up to, say, the same speed as the Toxic and you want to save a bit of money, then get that Vapor-X and just clock it to 1150 megahertz on the core. and 6400 on the memory, in which case it'll perform exactly the same as the Toxic, and you'll get it for a lower price. So that's going to round out this video, and that's going to round out the 280Xs from Sapphire, although I may do more in the future, but I'd rather be focused on the 290 and 290Xs. It's just it can be a little bit more difficult to get them. As I said, I'm really looking forward to doing the Vapor-X review of the R9 290, but finding one in New Zealand is proving to be pretty much impossible. So I'll have to wait till they arrive here unless I get one from overseas. So it might be a little while until that video comes out, but we'll just have to see how things go. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was educational. I hope it was informative, and I'll catch you guys next time.